Nobody expected an ordinary airport photo to become one of the biggest talking points in hip-hop, but that's exactly what happened. One moment, Rick Ross was simply waiting to board a commercial flight like thousands of travelers do every day. The next moment, social media exploded with accusations that one of rap's wealthiest personalities had secretly fallen on hard times. What made this so unusual wasn't the act itself. Flying commercial isn't strange. In fact, many wealthy people do it regularly. But Rick Ross isn't just another wealthy celebrity. For nearly 2 decades, he's built an entire empire around one idea: being bigger, richer, and more luxurious than everyone else around him. Every mansion, every custom car, every private jet, and every social media post reinforced the same message. He wasn't just successful. He was the biggest boss. That's why this single photo hit differently. The internet wasn't looking at a passenger waiting for a flight. They were looking at a brand that suddenly seemed vulnerable. Then, almost immediately, 50 Cent entered the conversation. And whenever 50 Cent smells weakness, he doesn't waste time. He understands modern internet culture better than almost anyone in hip-hop. He knows that facts often matter less than perception. He knows all it takes is one embarrassing image to create a story that people can't stop talking about. Suddenly, millions of people weren't asking whether Rick Ross flew commercial. They were asking whether his entire image had been hiding a much bigger problem all along. But this wasn't a story that started at an airport. The seeds had been planted years earlier, and what happened next would reveal why one simple photograph turned into a full-scale attack on Rick Ross's reputation. Long before the airport photo ever existed, Rick Ross carefully constructed one of the most recognizable brands in all of hip-hop. From the moment he released Hustlin' in 2006, he understood something many artists didn't. Music alone wasn't enough. People needed to believe the lifestyle. Every appearance, every interview, and every business venture became part of a much larger story. Rick Ross wasn't simply a rapper. He was selling an experience. He wanted audiences to imagine sprawling mansions, expensive watches, private jets, and unlimited wealth. Over time, that image became inseparable from his identity. His success expanded far beyond music. He acquired massive properties, invested heavily in real estate, purchased luxury vehicles worth millions, and built a thriving business empire that included dozens of Wingstop franchises and alcohol partnerships. He transformed Evander Holyfield's former estate into both a home and a business asset. On the surface, everything appeared flawless. Unlike many artists who burned through their money, Ross publicly positioned himself as someone who understood wealth preservation. He frequently gave advice about financial discipline and making smart investments. But that's exactly where the danger began. When someone builds a brand around appearing untouchable, every ordinary decision suddenly becomes extraordinary. If an average person flies commercial, nobody notices. If Rick Ross flies commercial, headlines appear everywhere. The bigger the image becomes, the harder it is to maintain. That's the hidden trap of being the biggest boss. Eventually, the image starts controlling the person instead of the person controlling the image. And unfortunately for Ross, the internet was about to discover just how fragile that image could be when one unexpected moment found its way into millions of people's feeds overnight. The moment the airport picture surfaced online, people reacted as if they had uncovered a secret that wasn't supposed to be seen. There wasn't anything dramatic happening in the image itself. There were no arguments, no confrontations, and no obvious signs of distress. Rick Ross was simply waiting for a commercial flight. But because of who he is, social media immediately transformed an ordinary moment into a worldwide discussion. Within hours, the jokes began flooding every platform. Fans started questioning why someone known for private jets was standing in a public terminal. Others compared the image to years of luxury posts Ross had proudly shared online. Then came Uncle Murda, who added fuel to the fire by mocking Ross and turning the situation into another round of G-Unit trolling. But things escalated even further when Drake's fanbase joined the conversation. Since Ross and Drake had already spent the previous years exchanging shots, many fans treated this as proof that Ross was somehow losing ground. The internet began connecting unrelated events together and building an entirely new narrative. That's how social media works today. One image quickly turns into a story, and that story eventually becomes accepted as truth regardless of whether it's accurate. Ross tried to defend himself by explaining that flying commercial can actually be a smart financial decision. Ironically, he'd said something very similar years before, publicly recommending commercial flights as a way to preserve wealth. But by then, nobody cared about logic. Once the internet chooses a narrative, explanations often make things worse instead of better. And while everyone else was focused on making jokes, one person was preparing to use this moment for something much bigger. Because 50 Cent wasn't interested in the airport itself. He was interested in what that airport represented. And once he started digging deeper, old controversies that many people had forgotten suddenly came rushing back into the spotlight. At this point, it becomes clear that 50 Cent was never interested in the airport itself. For him, this was never about a commercial flight or even about embarrassing Rick Ross for a single moment. 50 has spent years mastering something that very few artists understand: controlling the narrative. He knows that proving someone is broke is almost impossible, but making millions of people question whether they're broke is much easier. The moment the airport photo went viral, he immediately connected it to every old controversy Ross had ever been associated with. That's what makes him so dangerous. He doesn't create stories from nothing. He takes existing headlines, old rumors, and forgotten controversies and packages them together in a way that suddenly makes everything feel connected. Overnight, people stopped talking about a flight and started asking much bigger questions. Was the Biggest Boss image actually real? Had there been warning signs all along? Was the luxury empire starting to crack beneath the surface? Social media amplified every discussion, and before long, people who had never cared about Rick Ross's finances were suddenly investigating old tax records and previous headlines. That's exactly how 50 operates. He doesn't need to win an argument. He just needs to create doubt. And once doubt enters the conversation, it spreads faster than facts ever can. For Ross, that became the real problem. Because even if every accusation was exaggerated, public perception had already shifted. The airport photo had transformed from a harmless travel decision into a symbol that critics could point to whenever they wanted to challenge his image. But once people started digging into the past, they found several stories that only made the situation more complicated. This is where the story takes a much more serious turn, because the airport photo didn't create new problems. It simply reopened old ones. Over the years, Rick Ross has faced several financial and legal headlines that never fully disappeared from public memory. There were previous tax issues that forced him to pay millions of dollars, state tax disputes that resurfaced later, labor violation headlines connected to businesses associated with his empire, and lawsuits that generated unwanted attention. None of these stories individually were enough to destroy his reputation, but together they created a pattern that the internet couldn't ignore. That's one of the biggest dangers of celebrity in the digital age. Nothing ever truly disappears. The moment one embarrassing event happens, every old headline suddenly comes back to life. People began creating timelines, posting old articles, and building a larger story around Ross's public image. Some defended him by pointing out that successful entrepreneurs often deal with lawsuits and tax disputes. Others argued that repeated controversies eventually become impossible to dismiss. The truth probably sits somewhere in the middle. But online, nuance rarely wins. Instead, people prefer dramatic conclusions. Suddenly, Ross found himself in a difficult position because every response he gave only encouraged more people to dig deeper into his history. The more they searched, the more old stories they discovered. And eventually, one massive question started dominating every conversation. Was Rick Ross actually struggling financially, or was the internet simply exaggerating another celebrity moment? That question would soon become the center of the entire debate. Some people were convinced they already had the answer, but the reality turned out to be far more complicated than anyone expected. Some of Ross's previous labor-related controversies were also well documented and resurfaced during this period. At first glance, many people immediately jumped to the conclusion that Rick Ross was secretly running out of money. But when you examine the facts, that theory quickly begins to fall apart. Rick Ross still owns multiple properties, business investments, music royalties, liquor partnerships, and numerous franchise locations that continue generating revenue. Wealth on that scale doesn't simply disappear overnight because of one airport photo. The real issue is that many people confuse net worth with cash flow. Having assets worth hundreds of millions of dollars doesn't necessarily mean someone wants to spend unlimited amounts of money every single day. In fact, many wealthy people intentionally avoid unnecessary expenses because preserving wealth is often more important than showing it off. The irony is that Ross himself has spoken about this philosophy before. Years ago, he openly discussed making smart financial decisions and avoiding wasteful spending whenever possible. Flying commercial occasionally actually aligns with that mindset. But there's a problem. The luxury image he built became so powerful that audiences no longer allow him to behave like an ordinary person. If he flies private, people say he's showing off. If he flies commercial, people say he's broke. Every action now carries a hidden meaning. That's the downside of building a larger-than-life persona. Eventually, people stop seeing the human being and only see the character they've grown accustomed to watching. And even though Ross publicly explained that his private jet was temporarily unavailable due to upgrades, many people refused to believe him because doubt had already taken over the conversation. Ross later said the aircraft was receiving Starlink upgrades and that flying commercial was a temporary decision, not a financial necessity. At this point, it becomes obvious that Rick Ross's biggest challenge may not be 50 Cent at all. It may actually be the image he spent 20 years creating. For decades, he convinced audiences that he existed on a completely different level than everyone else. He wasn't just successful. He was supposed to be untouchable. But eventually, that kind of image becomes a trap, because the audience starts expecting perfection at all times. Every decision becomes a test. If he buys another mansion, people say he's trying too hard to prove he's rich. If he stops buying mansions, people say he's losing money. If he flies private, he's accused of showing off. If he flies commercial, he's accused of being broke. There is no winning once expectations become unrealistic. This is exactly why 50 Cent's strategy continues to work. He understands that you don't have to destroy someone's empire. You only have to expose a contradiction between the image and reality. Once that contradiction appears, audiences do the rest of the work themselves. Suddenly, every future decision Ross makes will be analyzed under a microscope. Every purchase, every business deal, and every social media post will be examined for hidden meaning. That's the hidden cost of building a brand around luxury. The bigger the image becomes, the harder it is to maintain. And eventually, the image can become larger than the person who created it. That's the uncomfortable situation Ross now finds himself navigating as millions of people continue debating whether the biggest boss can still live up to his own reputation. In the end, this entire situation was never really about a commercial flight, a Frontier terminal, or even an old feud between Rick Ross and 50 Cent. The real story is about perception in the internet era. We now live in a world where a single image can travel around the globe in minutes and completely reshape how people view a public figure. Rick Ross may still be extremely wealthy. His businesses may still be thriving. His empire may still be producing millions every year. But once people begin to question something, every future move becomes part of a much larger conversation. That's what 50 Cent understands better than almost anyone else in hip-hop. He knows that winning isn't about proving your opponent is bankrupt. Winning is about convincing the audience to ask whether it's possible. Because doubt spreads faster than facts, and first impressions often last much longer than explanations. This situation also highlights a deeper lesson about celebrity culture itself. The internet rewards extreme images, but eventually those same images become impossible to maintain forever. Rick Ross spent decades building one of the greatest luxury brands in hip-hop history, but now that brand may be so large that even he struggles to live inside it every single day. The real question was never whether he could afford a plane ticket. The real question is whether anyone can spend 20 years creating an untouchable image without eventually becoming trapped by it. Because history has shown us that building an empire is difficult, but convincing the world that empire can never fall may be the hardest challenge of all. Ross has maintained that the viral moment was overblown and that his jet was undergoing upgrades, while much of the online reaction was driven by perception rather than evidence of financial trouble.